For centuries, humans have been growing alongside our botanical brethren. Our histories have mixed and mingled to bring us modern medical marvels, faded folklore, and everything in between. Of course, in order to understand the plant, we have to start with its roots. I'm M. Grubner Gaddis, and this is Rooted. Hello. This week I'm coming at you from Orlando, where I'm gearing up for PlantCon this weekend. To celebrate getting to spend the weekend with thousands of rare plants and some pretty cool people, I figured we could dig into the history of how the heck we came to live with these leaf-covered roommates. So for starters, we're going to check out this blog from Plant Savvy. I just have to shout out, they're using the Monstera print from Matisse, which if you remember, he has like the coolest, giantest, most like beautiful Monstera, which we did cover in the Monstera episode. So if you haven't, you should check that out after this. But they're going over a quick history of houseplants and humans, kind of briefly explaining some similar thoughts that I think we all have, which is that it's kind of adorable that at some point, someone somewhere saw a random plant outside and was like, oh, they look lonely, they look vulnerable, like surely they would rather live in my nice warm house with me. Of course, like who wouldn't? And then they brought them inside, and I can only imagine it was kind of horrific for the plant at first. Like imagine someone cuts off your limbs and then is like, you live with me. Like we have movies about that. They're horror movies. But in this instance, we're like, oh my God, so sweet. Like they just wanted a little friend. And then over time, we slowly figured out what do plants actually like and what do they need for us to do in our homes to make sure that they are good places for plants. And now we all slowly commit to just making our own homes into essentially the Amazon rainforest just to like make them happy, which I kind of love. And obviously we have a lot of historical context for some of these things, but typically when we think of that, we're thinking of things like in our orange episode where I mentioned that one botanist loved them so much he started growing them in pots on boats to kind of give to people. And so typically like we have a long history of doing that with plants we perceive to be valuable in terms of like food crops or trade. But I'm more curious about the plants that we keep solely because they make us happy, right? Like plants that don't really produce food, they don't really do anything super helpful for us. And yet here we are completely renovating our houses to give like the perfect amount of light for our favorite anthurium or something. And so they're saying that early records of houseplants are typically traced back to 600 BC with the fabled Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And this would have been kind of just an absolute flex from the king or whoever they had at that time, kind of being like, I can sit in my chair with these plants that should be outside, but they're inside. So like I'm essentially having my own little beach day, but I've forced the beach to come to me by making it grow inside my castle, which is like fun. And so there's always been kind of this market for rare plants kind of stemming from that, right? Like you see someone that's got palm trees growing in their house and you're like, I want to do that. And how do I make sure this palm tree could like stay in my house forever? And what if it has cool variegation? Like I would pay more money if I knew that would work. And then they kind of are touching a little bit on the rare plant craze that started in 2020 when, people were paying crazy amounts of money for plants that now, because of tissue cultures and because the plant community has worked really hard to make things more accessible, we're not, thank God, all paying over $100 for like a single stem cutting, not even a leaf of pink princess philodendrons. But like even as long as we have had houseplants, we have had rare houseplants, and there have been people willing to spend lots of money on said houseplants, with a record of someone literally spending $16,000 of that time currency, not our currency, in 1890 for a super rare specimen of orchid. Luckily, if you're at PlantCon with me, the prices are not nearly that high. So shout out PlantCon and all of the vendors. Thank you guys so much for coming to Orlando and selling me cool plants at not $16,000. Okay, and then for all of my Victorian era girlies, hear me when I say this, ferns have always been my favorite. If they have always been your favorite, it's not a fluke, okay? Ferns were like, people were going feral for them. They were like, oh my god, she's so delicate, she's so dainty. Tag yourself, literally me. That was the Victorians at ferns. They were like, oh my god, she needs a fainting couch too. Like, she's so picky and temperamental, just like me. And so in the Victorian era, obviously that's a time where there was a huge class divide. We have people who have crazy amounts of opulence and wealth. And of course those bitches, they love a houseplant. But this is where we're really starting to see people kind of custom tailor their space or really find workarounds to keep plants that realistically, like, shouldn't live there. So before this, obviously, like I talked about, we had people that were kind of bringing plants on boats and stuff, but it was more like utilitarian. This is where people are really doubling down. They're like, I want that random fern that only grows in the Arctic, but I want it to grow in like sub-Saharan Africa. Like, I am God, but I don't want people to have to go outside to see that. I will create that in my house. And so this is where we really start getting into those really finicky houseplants, right? Because ferns, if you live in a place where ferns like it, you're probably like, ferns are so easy. Okay, I live in the middle of the desert. Ferns are not so easy. They hate it. But I work really hard because I also can't see ferns every day unless I commit to keeping them here. And that is a struggle in my life. You're welcome. You're welcome for me being vulnerable with you in this moment. But okay, this is also really fun and also a fun fact about this podcast. So for a while in the Victorian era, there was something called fern madness, which basically, okay, it's a little bit sexist, but basically it's women were going so feral for ferns and houseplants and like wanting to keep these plants alive and create like a lush green space for themselves that men started being like, they're nuts. Like, they're crazy. They're going feral for these ferns. And so eventually they kind of came up with a solution, which was making terrariums for ferns so that people weren't just like running outside and constantly trying to like rip ferns out of things. But this is historically kind of not the first time, but one of a very early example of women's hobbies essentially being called frivolous and dumb, which is really lame and stupid. But they literally were like, this is a mental illness, brother. And I kind of love that because what it gave way to were these images of these like mad women in greenhouses. And you see this a few times echoed throughout like film noir. And then it was also covered in a kind of recent movie called We Have Always Lived in the Castle, where essentially it's this like gloomy, moody woman, and she's in her plant room in her old dilapidated mansion. The walls are crumbling, but like her plants are in perfect condition, and everyone thinks she's nuts. And that imagery specifically is kind of what I strive for in this podcast, right? Like, I am an insane Victorian woman pouting into my ferns. But you're all here to like hear me out and listen, and I appreciate that about you. Okay. So basically, after the Victorian era, obviously, this is not, it is a history podcast, but also it's not, okay? So a lot of things happen, and we're fast forwarding. We're fast forwarding right through a bunch of that. And we're moving into World War II. And so right after World War II, we have a freaking houseplant boom. Okay, partially because women, while their husbands were at home, were like, work is hard. I am tired. I want my house to be beautiful. I'm going to get a houseplant and I'm going to freaking nurture the shit out of that thing. And they did, because you know what? There wasn't anyone there poo-pooing it. There wasn't anyone there to stop them when they wanted to get a little plant treat. And everyone was better for it. And so as people are suddenly becoming two-income households, they're also buying plants. But on top of that, obviously you can still write your man a letter from home, and they're talking about like, I love this plant. And so men start being like, maybe I could bring like some of these really cool plants home that we don't have in the United States. And that would be like a nice way to kind of remember my fallen friends and like also take something away from this that isn't just like meaningless pain. And so they brought back a bunch of African violets, which I think is kind of fun. Because then as we move into like the 50s and 60s, African violets are all the rage. And in working in a nursery, I can tell you, there's a very specific kind of woman who has been keeping African violets for probably like from the 50s and 60s. They are amazing, and I wish I could like live in their brains. But the way they can look at an African violet and just be like, here's everything you need to do to fix it. Also, African violet's kind of finicky. They sell specific pots just for African violets. And I need you guys to know that when I was like 12 years old, I painted one of those pots in pottery. And I still freaking killed the plant that my grandma gave me. I'm sorry, Barb. If you're listening, my grandma, I'm so sorry I let that African violet die. But yours look great. Anyway, enough about African violets, sorry. After the 60s, there was the space race, and we have like mid-century things. And in the 1960s, that's when we really see the rise of the monstera. Because people are like, that thing looks like an alien. What do you mean it puts on edible fruit, but only if it's the right kind of ripeness, and it looks crazy, and it tastes like 6 different fruits in one. And so people were like, whoa, this is crazy. And this is also around the time that NASA is starting to do a lot more research into plants, not just in space, but just in our spaces. And so this is when we're getting scientific, credible evidence that houseplants can improve air quality and they can improve quality of life. So people are seeing this study and they're justifying the price of monsteras with scientific backing, and we love to see it. Then in the 70s, we kind of have this counterculture movement that started in Boston, and that's when people got really into spider plants. You know, they said, I don't want to spend crazy amounts of money on weird-looking plants. I want a plant that's going to be easy to care for, that can chill in my, like, handmade macrame hanger, and that's going to put on a ton of little babies that I can literally share with my friends, and then none of us are going to pay taxes on it. We're bringing back bartering. And I love that. If you have a seed saving club or a propagation swap in your area, you need to take advantage of that. You need to get as many plant cuttings as you can for free. And we all need to be friends, especially in these times. And also, it's just a nod to the 70s. Like, technically, every time you do it, like, you're honoring a little hippie that would have done the same thing. So there. Okay. And then after the 70s, people were wrong. And they started being like, houseplants are for old people. Houseplants are for weirdos. Like, I'm not going to do that. And then 2020 hit. And everyone was like, oh my God, this is horrible. I live in a cage. I am a hamster. And I don't want to be. And then we all started getting back into houseplants. We started coming to our senses. And now we're here. We're here in an age where we can all love and appreciate plants outside and inside of our homes. And yeah, once again, we are like, houseplants are great. Now we have PlantCon, where we can all meet up and exchange our knowledge about plants. And we have all kinds of really fun things in that community. So if I haven't already sold you on PlantCon, you should definitely look into it. You should join our Discord. And we really hope that we'll see you in Orlando, or if not in Orlando, at one of our upcoming events. With that, I'm going to get back to work, but I hope this has inspired you to kind of take stock of your own library and maybe look in your local community to find out, like, where are other people who are into houseplants and what could I do to maybe beautify my space, or, you know, honor that first weirdo who was like, look at that lonely plant out there. I'm going to bring it inside. That's all I've got for this week, but I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and seeing you all next week. Until next time, be kind to yourselves, be kind to the earth, and just like a plant, drink your water. If you liked the show, please subscribe and consider leaving us a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or anywhere else you listen. You can also find us on Facebook and Instagram at rooted.pod. We're finally updating regularly on YouTube at rooted.podcast, and you can check out our website, rootedpod.com. for transcripts, updates, merch, and so much more. The show is written, produced, and hosted by me. I'm Grebner Gaddis, edited by Kat Fren of Fren Diagram, and our theme music was written and produced by Eric Cluxon. Rooted is a Henbane Media LLC production.